She is Professor of Cultural Studies and Hebrew Literature at JTS and the Chana Kekst Professor of Jewish Literature for this session on remembering the pandemic, learning from Yehuda Amichai. So this is a really different approach to this theme from what we've had in the past, doing a close reading of contemporary modern Israeli literature, and to explore the theme of how we will remember in the future what we're going through now. Just want to make sure you know how we will be handling questions. We'll be pausing periodically for questions during the class, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. We will end promptly at 2:15 Eastern Time. If Professor Mann and other people would like to stay on for additional questions afterwards, that's fine, but the official end will be on time. To raise your hand, you want to click on the participants, where it says participants in the bottom bar of Zoom, your Zoom window, and you'll see a hand icon. Click the icon to raise your hand, or again to lower. Feel free to test it out. If you're participating by phone, you can raise your hand or lower your hand by dialing *9. And when it's your turn to ask a question, then Rabbi Tim Bernard, our Director of Digital Learning, will call on you by name, and you can then go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question of Professor Mann. And do remember to phrase your question as the question with a question mark at the end. And I think that is all I have. You should receive the sources in the email that you got earlier today with the Zoom link for the session. And without further ado, I turn it over to Professor Mann to teach us today.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or if it's morning by you. How's the video? How's the sound? Everybody can hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, so thank you all for being here. I'm want to share my screen, and before we get to the Amichai poetry, I want to just say, just kind of frame our discussion about memory and sort of the contemporary moment, remembering the pandemic. Let's see, here we go. So it seems safe to say that we are obviously living through a historical moment. And, you know, one of the things that distinguishes this moment is, of course, how we are very much aware of the historical nature of the moment. And this sense that the commemorative process has really already begun. And this is very much, I think, in keeping with the idea that has always been very fundamental for me when it comes to talking about memory, which is that memory is very much kind of a habit or a product of the present. Of course, it has something to do with the past, but it's much more kind of living in and shaped by the concerns of the present. And you know, this front page of the New York Times, with many of you probably saw it when it was published on Sunday morning, May 24th, when the United States reached this horrible milestone of 100,000 deaths. It was one indication for me also how our memorial practices always are kind of connected to and indebted to memorial practices of the past. So this front page, for example, reminded me of of course, the technology. We are struggling with it. With this. So these are two pretty well-known memorial sites, which again sort of came to mind for me when I saw that front page of the New York Times. On the left, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., Maya Lin's amazing site. And then on the right, a wall from the Umschlagplatz in the Warsaw Ghetto, a memorial which also uses this device of the inscription of names, individual names on stone to commemorate the members of the Warsaw Jewish community who were deported to the camps. And so just a kind of a reminder that when we talk about memory in the pandemic, to recognize that memory never exists in isolation. It's always related to other memorial practices, even if we don't identify them in the moment. And even now we can sort of think about the different forms or the different ways that the different memory forms that might emerge from this particular moment having to do perhaps with the more recent period of social unrest, but also profoundly really shaped by technology and all of our relationship to technology, in particular, these kinds of virtual get-togethers. We know, some of you may have been on the receiving end of some of these requests. Many Jewish institutions, for example, are urging their audiences to become sort of amateur ethnographers, right? And to document the way they observed Passover Seders this year, or the way their communities are observing collectively certain ritual religious practices. We're being asked to journal our experiences and our emotions. So all of this, brings me to the work of Yehuda Amichai. And, I want to say, before we get to the poems, I just want to say a couple of words about Amichai as a poet, really one of the most beloved and central figures in modern Hebrew literature, possibly the most influential Hebrew poet of the last half century or so. And, biographically, Amichai comes to Palestine with his family as a 12-year-old from Germany. And in terms of his personal biography, he's very much a part of that generation of 48, the experience of the war, and the kind of collectivist national ethos that emerged in much of the writing and the cultural expression in that period. And his first book was published in 1955, and we see him coming back to the experience of 48 and his individual experience in the war, but also these more kinds of collective experiences of sacrifice and kind of a national ethos. At the same time, temperamentally, and this is really important for Amichai's work, he belongs to kind of a younger generation of writers who are more interested in or who privilege, let's say, in their work, a more kind of individual or private experience. And so all the time in Amichai's work, from the very beginning, really from the get-go until this final volume, this is a Patuach Sagor Patuach, Open Closed Open, which appeared in 1998, shortly before his death, in which he revisits a lot of the themes of his earlier work. But always these poems are really kind of characterized by this kind of, again, this sort of seesawing back and forth between a private experience and a more kind of collective experience. So I want to just, before we get to the poems, again, maybe some big themes to consider here. I've already mentioned this notion of private memory or private experience. And in the poem itself, we find these more individual notions of memory cast against and even in tension or some kind of competition with what we might think of as sort of national or institutionalized forms of memory. And so, what I have in mind here are holidays, museums, memorial sites. I call all of these other things vehicles of memory. That's just my own term to sort of distinguish them from something called the realm of personal or individual memory. Another kind of theme to keep in mind as we move through the poem is, again, something that I alluded to already. What do we think the differences between memory and history, and how might we consider the forces of the present impacting our sense of memory, as opposed to something that is more firmly rooted in the past. Now, I don't want you to think that I believe, if there are any historians in particular in the group, that history is always a kind of a function of the past. I don't entirely abide by this distinction, but it's just kind of something to keep in mind, again, as we move through the poem and we think about the different ways that the poem urges us to consider the past. And then finally, memory as a kind of a repeating figure or trope or tradition, especially in relationship to trauma. And for those of you who have had a chance to read this poem series, you know that even though the bulk of the poem is sort of relates to the experience of 1948, towards the end, we get sort of pitched back in time to a European setting and to the memory of the Holocaust. And so when it comes to trauma, there is this sense of sort of repeating traditions, repeating tropes of memory. Okay. So from the beginning, and I'm going to move through some of these poems. Some of them I'll read aloud, some in Hebrew, some in English. We're not going to get to all of them. If there are, pieces that you have read or things that you have questions about, I'm going to pause at some point. So we'll have an opportunity for that as well. This comes from, as I mentioned, this final volume that Amichai published in 1998. And the volume, which has been beautifully translated by Chana Kronfeld and Chana Bloch. You can also find portions of it in sort of a collected edition of Amichai's poetry in English, edited by Robert Alter. The book as a whole is a series of poem cycles. So what you're looking at is one cycle or series of poems from this volume. And you'll notice that both the Hebrew version of the book, which came out, that's in the blue there, and the English language version include this bit of tombstone. It's kind of a gravestone with the word Amen on it. And there is actually a poem called the Amen Stone in the book. And we learned through the course of the book that this is a stone that Amichai himself brought back from a trip to Europe, perhaps his hometown in Germany, and he keeps it on his desk as a kind of a talisman, as a sort of an artifact. So you can see how when he is working in his space, when he's writing his poetry in the present, he's very much kind of aware, I think, of himself as connected to the past and as part of a certain kind of tradition. So I want to say one word about this kind of enigmatic opening line here. Mi yizkor et hazochrim. I'm going to read the first verse in Hebrew and then talk a little bit about that line and about some of the allusions that we find here. So, פסוקים ליום הזיכרון, מזמור זכירה למתים במלחמה, גם דור הזוכרים הולך ומת, חציו בשיבה טובה, חציו בשיבה רעה, ומי יזכור את הזוכרים. So the sort of, I mean, I'm calling it enigmatic, but that title, that line, mi yizkor et hazochrim, who will remember, the rememberers, it gets repeated in this verse and also at other points in the poem. And I want to suggest that it puts the burden of memory squarely on human agents. What do I mean by agents, right? It means that human subjects, individuals, individual people, we are responsible for memory. We are responsible for remembering. So it's one thing if you get, you have a calendar that tells you when to light a yahrzeit candle, or, there's the 4th of July and you're supposed to remember something on the 4th of July. Or even if you go to a museum or a memorial site, right? These are all vehicles of memory. These are all forms of memory that I think the poem in part, the poem as a whole, kind of is critiquing on some sense. He's saying, don't rely on those museums to do the memory work. Don't rely on the calendar cycles so much. Rely on human agents who will remember the rememberers, the human agents that are kind of at the source, at the heart of all memory processes. And you notice here also in the Hebrew, I mean, this is a wonderful translation, and obviously we all know that something is lost in any translation. But I want to say that I really love this translation. But the one issue that I take with them is how they translate the term psukim. In the Hebrew, I mean, I don't know, maybe you disagree, right? Verses, maybe lines. It's really kind of hard to know. But what I want us to hear here in the Hebrew is that a pasuk, it's not just any old idea of a verse or a line. It's expressly a biblical idea. In other words, there's this kind of gesture from the very opening of the poem that there's a sense in which this document, which, to be clear, this is not a prayer. The poem is not a prayer. The poem is not liturgical. And even though I know within the American Jewish community, there is this kind of fondness to read Amichai's poetry in synagogue settings, and maybe even to, incorporate it into certain liturgical processes. That's, not only is that not what Amichai meant, it's also sort of inappropriate for the genre, in my opinion, but that's another discussion. So this is a secular work. This is a lyric expression. And yet Amichai, he sees fit to sort of alert us to the fact that this secular expression is really connected to, this kind of ancient biblical tradition, and specifically to Judaic forms of memory. So let's move on to the next verse here. So I'm going to pause after all of this. There's going to be time for questions in a few minutes, right? But I want us to move through verses 2 and 3 together, and then I'll stop the screen sharing and we'll take some questions. But I want us to understand I want you to appreciate the specific details in verse 2, in that second stanza there, right? And I'm referring to the stanza that begins, how does a monument come into being? A car goes up in a red blaze at Shar Hagai, a car burnt black, the skeleton of a car, and next to it, the skeleton of some other car, charred in a traffic accident on some other road. The skeletons are painted, he's referring to the cars here, right? The skeletons are painted with anti-rust paint, red like the red of that flame. Near one skeleton, a wreath of flowers now dry. From dry flowers, you make a memorial wreath, and from dry bones, a vision of resurrected bones. And somewhere else far away, hidden among the bushes, a cracked marble plaque with names on it, an oleander branch like a shock of hair on a beloved face hides most of them. But once a year, the branch is cut back, and the names are read, while up above, a flag at half-mast waves as cheerfully as a rag at the top of the flagpole, et cetera, and who will remember the rememberers? So the site that's being referred here is quite specific, and I wanted us to just, some of you may be familiar with it. This is an area on the road from the coast in Israel up to the city of Jerusalem. And during the war, this was during the war in 1948, it's called Shar Hagai, right? The sort of this passageway. And in Arabic, Bab el-Wad. There's a number of poems within the Israeli tradition that refer specifically to this site. And so Amichai is relying on his readers not only to maybe have passed by this site in their car, driving on that road, but also kind of the echoes of some of the other literary works about this space, and specifically about the historical significance of this particular battle in relationship to Israeli independence. And so you see here on the left, a photograph from 47, 48, this medical convoy was bombed, and the vehicles there, the military vehicles, were left in place for a number of years as a kind of an improvised memorial site in relation to the war. At some point, there are two pieces here that are kind of referred to in the poem. At some point, the vehicles, the skeletons, quote unquote, of the vehicles are moved to the other side of the road, right? They wanted to make the road larger, there's more traffic. So they moved them, not in the original space where the battle first happened. They moved them and they kind of left them there, still as a memorial site. And then eventually, there's one more step here. They were sort of painted over a second time, and these wreaths are put on every year on Memorial Day, on Yom HaZikaron, when soldiers are when the deaths of soldiers are commemorated, and the events of the war are very fresh in public memory. So this is the site that Amichai is interested in exploring, and you can see, this classic, really, this verse, the way that the speaker, right, the poetic speaker, kind of moves associatively and really effortlessly between different objects and different moments in time, right? All the while asking, how do we remember? this event. This event is important for a certain set of reasons, right? What's the best way? Should we leave those military vehicles where they are? Is there something about like the sort of the authentic quality of them as ruins, right, in their space? That's the thing that's going to really trigger people and make them appreciate those events. Or maybe, you know, if they're looking kind of dirty and schmutzy, maybe we should paint them over. But then they look new. Then they're not old anymore. And what kind of a memorial is that? You want it to look old. Well, maybe we should make art out of them. You know, and here we get, again, this is a really sort of effortless, I think, and it's typical in its effortlessness of Amichai as a poet, that he kind of sneaks in this little reference to Yechezkel, to Ezekiel there, right? From dry flowers, you make a memorial wreath. From dry bones, a vision of resurrected bones. So, you know, he's playing around, but he's not playing around. Like if when you read these poems, you kind of find yourself smirking or smiling, I think that is an appropriate reaction, right? He wants us to get the joke, but he's deadly serious also about the joke. In other words, is the memorial site meant to be, I'm going to use the word messianic, right? I mean, the Ezekiel's vision there, right, of the bones, right, the resurrection of the bones, that's a messianic moment. That's something that we're supposed to look forward to at some, you know, unforeseen date in the future. So there's this kind of, you know, at the same time, there's this sort of reversion to something that is very tactile, right? There's all of this kind of maybe abstract conversation about the military vehicles, but then at the same time, there's someone's individual gravestone that has names on it, and we don't see it most of the year. But once a year, we get together and we cut back, you know, the bushes so that we tend the site and we attend to the site, right? We are in that space and having that memory. I see that there are lots of questions in the chat. I want to go through one more verse, and then I'm just going to take a pause for a moment. This is section 3. It's at the top of your page 2. And he asks us, what is the correct way to stand at a memorial ceremony? איך עומדים בטקס זיכרון? זקופים או כפופים, מתוחים כאוהל או ברישול של אבל? Should we stand up straight and be sort of proud and attentive? Or should we somehow should our bodies sort of show the burden of grief? What's the best way to stand? And when is the best time to think about our loved ones? Like, is it, he says, at noon when shadows are hidden beneath our feet, or at twilight when shadows lengthen like longings? She'en lehem reshit velo tachlit kamo Elohim. So we get a little bit of Migdal in there, right? We get a little bit of the liturgy there as well, to remind us that in those moments of sort of personal attentiveness to grief, there's also in Amichai's world something that is, I hesitate to call it theological, but it's definitely spiritual, right? There is God talk in Amichai's work. And one of the big questions about not just Amichai's work, but I think about all of contemporary Hebrew Israeli literature by Jewish authors is, where is God? How is God in there? That's a whole other topic. But Amichai is really one of the people who perplexes us, right? What is the stance towards religious observance here, or to some idea of metaphysics, of transcendence? Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Let me see. Is there, Tim, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to kind of field. I would just ask people, you know, if they have questions about what we've read so far, about anything that I've said so far. There's going to be time at the end of the session for more sort of general conversation or conversation about the poem as a whole. But I would welcome now anything, maybe a few questions, just to kind of give me a moment to take a sip of water. Tim, do you want to field some? Where's Tim?
Yeah, we have a question from Richie.
Maybe you can spotlight him. It's great to see all your faces. Welcome, everyone. Now I can see you all. I have like a dozen pages of you on my Zoom screen. That's really great. I don't know, Richie, are you going to ask something?
You're unmuted now. We should be able to hear you. Richie?
No, maybe someone else. We'll come back to Richie. I see some people are raising their hands. I think we should, we should honor that because they figured out how to raise hands in Zoom. That's a skill set.
Martin?
Hi, this is Martin Kagan. I'm from Houston, Texas, and have driven past Shar Hagai many times. And one of the things that struck me in your picture versus the poem is he makes a point about the painting of these skeleton vehicles in red, which reminds you of Rust-Oleum, or one of those things that we use for anti-rust. And yet the new manifestation of these things, it looks like painted them like khaki, military colors, as if they're current day vehicles.
Yes.
And that kind of surprises me.
I think, well, I don't want to put the pictures back up again, but I can at the end to just, if people don't understand exactly what you're referring to. But I think that the sort of change, the evolution of that site, both in respect to what you're referring to, the painting, right, the different colors of paint, as well as in their location vis-a-vis the road itself, as well as, every once in a while they add another plaque, or, as the events of 48 recede in public memory and it becomes more and more something that's taught in schools and not necessarily something that people either personally experienced or had kind of a family member who experienced, there's more informational stuff there as well. So all of this, I think, goes to the idea that memory really is a product of the present, right? That we remember the past in terms of the needs of the present, right? What are the political demands of the present, even that would determine where these things are located and who gets to put a wreath up, et cetera, et cetera. So that I think that's a really interesting. I think it's an accurate assessment there. Maybe one more, Tim.
Beth?
Hi, my name is Beth Nadich. I'm a rabbi outside of Boston, so I'm already thinking about high holidays. And I was really curious about what you said earlier about the memory, putting the burden of memory purely on human agents. And I was curious about is he making a statement about God and God's memory, or is he not in that realm at all?
So I don't think that Amichai is really interested in God's memory. I'm just going to go out there and say that, which doesn't mean that we might not be, or that you might not be, or that other readers of this poem might not be. That's fine. I don't think that that's Amichai's interest. I think that when he says Miskot Azuchrim, and I'm kind of framing that, urging you to understand that line as a question that puts the burden of memory on the individual, right? Who will remember the rememberers? I mean, it's even in English, it kind of has, I think, a nice ring, right? I think that the context for that sort of elevation of the individual is absolutely within the context of the sort of hyper presence of memory in Israeli society. And I'm going to even say the often oppressive presence of memory in Israeli institutionalized memory. We're talking about schools and the army and the calendar cycle. In other words, this is, when I say the calendar year, I'm not talking about the religious calendar. I'm talking about all of it, right? The Israeli civic holidays, which operate in conjunction with some of the traditional Judaic commemorative days, but are not the same, right? Yom HaShoah is not Tisha B'Av. They're two different things. Yom HaShoah is an invention, Holocaust Remembrance Day is an invention of the state. Tisha B'Av has been around a lot longer than the state of Israel, as you know. So, so I think that this kind of the refrain and the way that the speaker in the poem really wants us to pay attention to the rememberers, not the museums, the rememberers. not the holidays, the rememberers, not, you know, that would be my sense of the right context. Now, you want to go to God, you can go to God, but in this instance, right, especially when you get to that last verse that I read, and even we'll see in the next verse as well, right, that there's a sense here that he's testing them out. He's like, all right, you know, I've been to all these ceremonies. What's up with that? Do they really make us remember? That's, you know, part of it. Or have they become sort of rote and ritualistic? I mean, I think, just to sort of parenthetically insert here, when we say we're experiencing Zoom fatigue, I think we're talking about something similar. Or even just think about your own, I'll think about my own practices as an individual in the pandemic and what I felt compelled to record and kind of write down 2 months ago or a month ago, and what I feel now. There's something about the ritualized form of memory. At some point it reaches, I hesitate to use graphs that go up, but at some point it kind of, it's not useful anymore, right? And so that's why at the end of this poem cycle, if you've read it, you know that he introduces forgetting. And he's sort of like, you know what, a little bit of forgetting is okay. All right, I've gone on too far. Let's take one more, Tim, yeah? Because I saw that there were a lot there. Thank you.
Table.
Hi. I know in a way it's a naive question, but I hope it's okay to ask. I professionally do things with novels all the time, and clearly in the world of novels, what an author thinks he or she is writing about is not necessarily clear to the author. I mean, subconscious, we don't always know ourselves, certainly. But poetry is so much more compact. When people analyze poetry, is there that same sense that despite what the poet says, you can't always believe the poet? And that has to do with everything that
yeah, in the interest of
everything
time,
that's going on in the chat about, was he religious? Did he care?
okay.
His vocabulary.
So here's the thing. This is my rule of thumb. I met Amichai, okay? And he was a lovely man, and we had, you know, we shared conversations and all of that. But that has nothing to do with this poem. Sorry, right? There's a difference between the poet and the poetic speaker. And that applies for all literary works. I don't know if you want to call it a narrator in a novel, I guess you could. But I think it's incumbent upon us as readers, as good readers, to sort of make a little bit of space between the poet and the poetic speaker. And so it's true, I'm going to contradict myself just a little bit, right? In the great tradition of Walt Whitman. You know, it's true that these poems in this particular volume, because Amichai was writing them at the end of his life, and he understood that he was dying, he was sick, he knew the end was coming, and so there are kind of portions of these poems that read as personal meditations. But always, I think it's worth our while to not assume that the I in the poem, right, that first person singular in the poem, is the poet speaking, especially for someone like Amichai, right, who's always very, sort of interested in that very complex oscillation between the personal and the public, right, between the individual and the collective. Okay, we have to read a little more of this poem, and then we'll come back. And I'm not in the chat. I just want you to know, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to pay attention to any of you. So I'm not in the chat, but I will read it afterwards, and I'm really interested. I see little pieces pop up, but I can't really respond to the chat. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, Tim, to unspotlight our last question. And here's everybody again for me. Okay, so we've looked at space and sort of the place, different sort of specific sites, of memory, these kind of memorial sites, institutionalized memorial sites, things that are really, that whole site on the road to Jerusalem, that is a product of the state, and how, the Israeli nation state wants us to understand its heroic past, its military past. And so Amichai is, he's kind of interested in that again, but he wants to know about the individual experience. In section 4, I'm going to introduce a term here. I mean, you know, I'm talking about literature, so I got to use some terms, right? I'm going to use the word genre. And it seems to me that in this section, ech nikonen, what should our lament be? I think that the Hebrew here is much more succinct. How do we grieve? How do we lament? Ech nikonen. Bekinat David et Shaul v'Yonatan, minashrim kalu, me'ariot gavru, kach nikonen. So, you know, it should remind you a little bit of that, the beginning of the poem where he says psukim, right? And he kind of, he's nodding back to ancient forms of lament or memory, right? Ancient forms of memorialization, traditional Judaic forms. Remember that sort of that notion that I put forward at the very beginning, you know, thinking about memory forms memory as a trope, as something that repeats and that is indebted to older memory forms. And so here he's reverting a little bit to, you know, one of the great archetypal forms of memory and grief. And I realize that memory and grief are not the same thing, but here I think he's talking about both. And maybe we are often talking about both. We can get to that later, right? But here he's sort of saying, look, within the Judaic tradition, we have a form. Let's use it. We have a genre. It's the genre of the Chana. This is, if anybody's interested, it's in Shmuel Bet, right? The second book of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 23, right? So this is David's elegy, the lament about Shaul v'Yonatan, and he says, "Minashlim kalu me'ariot gavru," right? It's filled with love and this kind of heroic imagery. And notice how he gives us the imagery, and the quotation there, it's not an allusion with an A, right? Sometimes in modern Hebrew poetry, we get what we call these kind of intertextual references to older Hebrew texts. And you have to sort of decode them, right? And this is not, you have to decode them, you have to be kind of a good reader, you have to know the text he's talking about. This is not that. This is a direct quote. And even in the original Hebrew, we get the quotation marks. So Amichai, he's not messing around. He's saying, look, within, and when I say Amichai, I mean the poetic speaker, but the writer here, right? See how they're hard to keep apart sometimes? Got myself. We have this great tradition. Let's capitalize upon it, right? It's poetic, it's vivid, it's emotional, it packs a punch. I mean, in biblical language, there's nothing like it. Minashrim kalu me'ariot gavru, right? It has this kind of resonance and it reads like poetry. And he immediately punctures it, right? He says, well, look, you know, that's all good and fine. But if they had really been that fast and if they had really been that strong, they would still be alive. So enough with the purple prose, right? Enough with that kind of high language of heroism, right? And I was kind of thinking here, I'm just going to interject again another sort of contemporary thought, you know, the language of heroism is everywhere now, right? Who are the heroes? Our heroes on the front lines, our hero, you know, like, and I sort of, I want to understand how to talk about what people are doing and how to describe it and how to memorialize it. And we're surrounded by this everywhere. I mean, I live in New York and I read the New York Times, so I have my little bubble. But everywhere, all over the internet, right, as well. There's a lot of kind of language. I think that we're in this moment where people are really kind of reaching for a language to think about heroism in new terms. And that's also been complicated by the murder of George Floyd and the last month of protests, right? Our understanding of what heroism is, I'll speak personally now, in this country and in relation to the pandemic, but broader than that even. I think we're taking another look right now, and maybe we could take a page from Amichai, right? To just be really conscious of the language that we use when we talk about heroism and how we memorialize heroism. And also, this is the last thing I'll say about that verse, to sort of appreciate, this is one of the things that I mean when I say that memory is a product of the present, that certain historical periods generate different memory forms. And so the biblical lament is particular to the composition of biblical literature. It sort of suited the social needs of the community in that moment. The example that I know best in terms of, again, the question is what genres or what forms, what memory forms emerge from different historical periods is, of course, the Yisker book, the memorial book, which is kind of tethered in Judaic tradition and in older memorial forms, but really came into its own as a genre immediately after the Holocaust. We have over 1,000 of these books, they're a new literary genre, right? They sort of resemble history books a little bit, and they resemble Pinkasim. They have lists, and they have the candles, and in other words, they have, this is another topic, but I think it's relevant, right? They're attached to memorial forms, to traditional Judaic memorial forms, but they emerged specifically from the destruction of small Jewish towns during the Holocaust. And so the Yisker books, each one of them takes their name from a town, and is, as a genre, it's wholly a post-war invention. So it's worth our while to think just a little bit, analytically, and think, well, what are the memory genres that will emerge from this current moment? Some of them are probably related to Zoom. Some of them are probably shaped by technology, but a lot of them are not, right? The sort of the return of the book and these kind of hyper-local practices of memory, which are not connected to any sort of virtual technology, but which are really firmly rooted in place. Okay. 5 and 6. We're moving forward, and then there's going to be time for discussion. I have to confess that these two stanzas often confuse me, and they might have confused you too. You're probably thinking, she's supposed to be running this, right? But I think that there is, as a poet, Amichai really revels in contradiction and these kind of inversions and reversals, and it's up to us to sort of tease them apart and sort of judiciously weigh where we think the center of meaning of the poem resides. So in your verse 5, the numeration here, by the way, if you go to look for these poems in Hebrew and in English, it's slightly different, but for our purposes, I'm looking now at the poem that begins on the top of your page 4. And there's a discussion in both of these, or at least in that first one, the distinction between the fruit of the Yasmin, of the jasmine, and the flower, right? And he says, no one has ever heard of the fruit of the jasmine. No poet has sung its praises. They all sing drunken odes. This is really interesting. Sharu shikurim. Shir lo hilel. Oh, that's interesting. Where do we get the odes from? All right, I'll have to find out, right? That's a kind of a heavy-handed translation. Odes to the jasmine flower, its heady scent, its color, white against dark leaves, the vigor of its blossoming, the force of its short life. But no one has ever heard of the fruit of the jasmine. So I was trying to think, like, what is at stake for Amichai? What is at stake for the poet here in, sort of noticing this distinction? And if you've ever been around a Yasmin vine, it's absolutely the case. I don't even know what the fruit of the jasmine plant looks like, but I definitely know the smell. And so I think, what he's up to here, he wants us to focus on the way in which this is the key line, the vigor of its blossoming, the force of its short life, right? That there's a notion here that we tend to elevate, right? Or memorialize this kind of dramatic shortness. Yeah, I mean, I think that this goes to the question of heroism again, right? What gets privileged? Is it a short, dramatic life, or is it this kind of more, the fruit, something that takes longer? And again, you understand the distinction, right? I mean, I think that for me, I can't see you on the screen there, so I have no idea if you know what I'm talking about. Just give me like a thumbs up if you get the distinction. Somebody, yes, thank you, there you go. So again, I think of, apologies for my New York centric, but in the Times every week, they have an extended section of obituaries, and you see people's ages, and most of them are COVID related. And so I have to sort of, check my own reactions when I see a 40-year-old has died, or I see a 90-year-old has died, right? So I think that that's kind of what he's going for here. The poem is just trying to sensitize us to our own assumptions and judgments about a life worth lived, especially in this relationship to sort of drama and duration. Now, okay, maybe. But then he like contradicts himself completely in the beginning of that next verse. No one praises the blossoms of the blind. Everyone praises the fruit of the vine and blesses the wine. Wait a minute. I thought we were talking about the fruit and the flower. So I don't understand that reversal. If somebody can explain that to me in the discussion afterwards, I would be very happy. The important point for me in this stanza, right, in stanza 6, is the presence of the speaker's father, because this is again in that sort of that spirit of the poet writing this book as a way of kind of wrapping up, or like a kind of a summary statement about his work, really. And the figure of the father appears a lot in Amichai's work. And here we see him. I'm going to read this part in Hebrew because it's really beautiful. Right? So his father has these wise hands. It's just the Hebrew is the English and the wisdom of his hands. It sounds kind of funny, right? Does that mean his father was good with his hands? I don't know exactly what it means, but it's a marvelous expression, right? His hands were wise. And he knew how to wrap parcels really well. Right? He would notice the sort of the repetition there of chazak, chazak. That's an echo of something, I'm sure. So he knows how to package them really well so they won't open up. We've all received packages that have opened en route, and it's really disappointing. Yes? And then he takes this really sort of homey kind of image of the father's, really kind of tender, I think, image of his father's wise hands and his ability to be, kind of caring when he's sending a package to someone, and he immediately moves, right? This is another one of those sort of beautiful associative leaps that's so characteristic of Amichai's work. He moves it metaphorically to another realm, and all of a sudden he's not talking about mailing packages in the US mail or the Israeli mail system, which is a lot more reliable than ours, by the way. We sense that he's talking again about memory, right? He's setting us up really for the end of the poem, right? For the end of the poem where we get that kind of, that very powerful couplet, shachuach zachor, shachuach patuach sachuach. And so this notion that you can wrap something up so tightly that it's never opened. If that's also a form of remembering, and maybe that's even kind of a special privileged form of remembering, right? We get to that in verse 7 with this, again, another analogy or metaphor, right? Remember the father wrapping things up. He's like, well, I've come to the end of that metaphor. I've come to the end of the tree. First we get the flower fruit, then we get the packaging, and now he's going to try a third metaphorical domain, the domain of preserving and pickling. I've been doing a lot of pandemic pickling, so this spoke to me pretty well, right? Misko, ubama mishamrim zikaron. So here, there's this idea, I love it, really. Memory is this kind of tactile, like a radish or a sliced cucumber. And, how do we preserve that? How do we keep it intact, right? Is it salt? Is it sugar? Is it vinegar? Do we boil it? Do we put it in the freezer, right? And all of these different examples. And then he jumps, right, from all of that language about the kitchen to, again, his main concern. Here's the metaphorical concern with memory. Aval shimur hazikaron, to preserve memory, right? The best way to preserve memory, lishamro betoch hashichacha. Ha, surprise. The best way, it's very paradoxical, right? The best way to preserve memory is to just forget about it, to just kind of bury it deep away. Now, if there are any psychologists or analysts on the call, maybe they can speak to this this notion, right, of what is he talking about there, that to forget something is a way of preserving it. I guess, you know, part of it has to do with, and even this beautiful line there, lo tuchal le'olam lachzor letoch ve'lafriya et minuchat hanetzach shel hazikaron. So the zikaron there, memory there, becomes almost this kind of corpse, right, or sort of a soul who we need to leave it alone. We need to let it rest. Maybe I'm gonna pause here and just see if there are any questions. The chat is exploding, but I'm not looking at it. But I'm going to ask Tim maybe to see if there are any like specific questions about stuff that I've talked about so far, and then we'll go almost to the end, or I'll stop a few minutes before the end for more discussion. Tim, do you want to call on some people? Some raising hands?
Mary?
Me? Yeah. Interesting thought about, in order to preserve memory, forget about it. But that makes sense in a kind of way, because what may happen as you remember is details may alter in the light of whatever your present life is like. I'm not saying it would necessarily, but by preserving it, which means you haven't forgotten it, is buried somewhere deep in your mind, that it's in kind of its original form as it was when you experienced it or when you saw it.
It's a really,
that's the way I feel.
It's a really interesting point, because I think what you're raising is, you know, this question of like, what's the best memory? It's almost like that game Telephone, you know, like that's what memory is. You just keep passing it along and along and along and along, and it changes depending upon who's speaking it and who's hearing it. So do we think that's bad? I don't know. I would sort of hesitate. I hesitate to judge one way or the other, right? And we know even that when it comes to the idea of testimony, for example, like first person testimony is often tremendously unreliable. So, you know, it kind of depends on what our measure is, what the value is here, what are we interested in when we say that we want to memorialize something. Tim, you want to call on a couple more while we're here?
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'm just piggybacking on what the previous speaker said, that sometimes when you share a memory, and it's something very precious to you, or you have a certain image, it gets tainted when someone else says, well, that's not how I remember it. It becomes a different memory. And I think that has happened to all of us probably. And it's very interesting to me.
Thank you. What, maybe one more, Ted? Tim, sorry.
Norman?
Yes. Is it okay to go back to verse 4?
No problem.
Okay. I was just wondering,
Especially because you got CCNY going on there.
Class of 62.
My daughter just graduated high school.
I'm just wondering where he asks, what should our lament be? Now that could mean content, but I'm wondering if it also means, for how long should we be in mourning, if you will? And the words swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, could that suggest that our lament should be very powerful, but not for a long, but lament and give it everything that you feel you need to give it, and then move on to something else?
I mean, these are, again, this is why I mentioned the analysts or the psychologists who are on this call, because it seems to me that what he's saying also in that the stanza that we just read about the preservation and when to notice, when to stop, when to know to stop, when does it become destructive? And I think that's, you know, that measure. I don't think Amichai, as a poet, I don't think he was the first poet to sort of observe this, but it's, again, within the context, this is important, you know, the sort of overabundance, the hyper memorialized cultural landscape within contemporary Israel, and the way that memory the Holocaust in particular, but not only, is politicized and is, you know, is kind of, I don't want to say diluted, right? But there is this sort of way in which it's instrumentalized. That's a better term there. So, you know, I don't know if the solution is to just, you know, put it away and forgetting, but he does seem to be commenting here on the potentially like deleterious effects of remembering too much. I mean, we're having our own conversation about memory now in relation to the past in this country. That's a whole other topic, but connected, I think. All right, maybe one more. Yeah, Tim?
Well, Adam?
Yes, hi. So I don't know how credible this is, but I learned from Star Trek, Commander Riker, that he like once said in an episode that if you want to figure out a solution to something, or you want to learn from something on your own, you remember, you study it or think about it really hard and really carefully, and then you forget about it completely and you just like shift your focus to somewhere else. Just meditate on it and then like just completely forget about it. I'm just wondering if that has like, I'm thinking that is a parallel with the memory.
I don't know. I mean, you know, I usually am really hold by Jean-Luc and not, you know, by Jean-Luc Picard more than your guy, but in Star Trek terms. You know, I think I'm just going to come back to the frame here, right? This is a poem, and one of the reasons why I wanted to share it with you, it's a poem that really stimulates a lot of talk and a lot of, like, I think, productive frameworks for thinking about memory. But again, so that we know, he's speaking about a very particular context, right? And so, and when he again, the Israeli context. And so all of those references from the first 1 or 2 or 3 stanzas that we looked at, they are, you know, very sort of typical, you know, parts of the apparatus of memory within Israeli society. And it's not, you can't choose. I think that was what I would say in response to your question, that there's a sense within the poem, or within the sort of the poem's critique of the institutionalization of memory within Israeli society, is that there's little room to choose. You're in school and you have to stand a certain way. You're in the army, or you're in a kind of a ceremony, and you can only, you know, say certain parts in the ceremony. You have to hold your body. It has to be a particular kind of it. So look, these are these kind of mnemonic devices in a big way, right? That allow a society to remember. And also, I would say, in the case of Israel, when we're talking about post 48 and after the Holocaust, they were necessary ways of handling national trauma, right? In other words, they were things that people needed. But now, 50 years later, right? The poem was published in 1998, so 50 years after the establishment of the state, maybe there's room for change, right? Maybe we need to kind of look at how those institutions of memory have become kind of like either fossilized or inappropriate, and precisely because they don't seem to allow for this kind of fluidity. So I want to finish just looking at the last bit of the poem, and then we will have plenty of time for me to kind of look at the chat for a minute, and for other questions and comments. I'm really interested to hear what everybody has to say. So, you know, I mentioned earlier that most of the poem is really kind of thinking about this question of 48 and military heroism in relationship to, again, a very specific set of categories within Israeli culture. But, you know, there's, you know, we need to get, oh, somebody's got Borges down there. Oh, I love Borges, got to bring that up afterwards. You know, the sort of the movement here in that last section. This is section 8 and 9. And remember the book covers that I showed you at the very beginning of our session. Remember the Amen stone, the Amen stone, that piece of the tombstone. I can put it up again maybe after I finish so you can see it. But you know, this sort of scrap, kind of an artifact that that the poet refers to as a sort of a talisman or a kind of an artifact that triggers him in some way, or that he's honoring. He has it on his desk and it's on his mind when he's writing about memory. And so we move back in verse 8 to it's a very different topography, right? It's a different landscape, and he identifies it. The Beit HaKvarot Bavarsha. You could find pictures of this online as well. You know, if you have had the chance to visit Warsaw, the Okopova, the cemetery that he's referring to, it's the part of the city, the only part of the city that survived the war intact. I guess there are probably some military or geopolitical reasons for that, but or maybe some theological, spiritual reasons for that. I don't know, but it is you know, this very overgrown and enormous piece of real estate that abuts the former ghetto in Warsaw, and many generations of the Jewish population in Warsaw are buried there. And so, and it kind of has that forest primeval feel to it, right? If you're there in the summer, you're inside and it's very shady, and parts of it are tended a little bit, but a lot of it is, you know, looks like the depiction here, where the natural forestation has been allowed to kind of merge and disturb, physically disturb the graves. He says, "Chipush shorashim bebeit hakvarot bavarsha," seeking roots in the Warsaw cemetery. Here it is the roots that are seeking. They burst from the ground, overturn gravestone, and clasp the broken fragments in search of names and dates, in search of what was and will never be again. The roots are seeking their trees that were burnt to the ground. I think, you know, now that I'm reading this again, it feels to me like there's, if we had time, we could go back to the sort of the fruit and flower stanzas, right? That he's kind of revisiting that. I feel like he's not, when I say he, I mean the speaker here, like he's not satisfied with his own metaphorical reflections. Like, I tried the fruit and the flower, not quite. I tried the fruit and the wine, maybe now I can, you know, I can kind of get it right. Maybe it's the trees and the roots. Maybe that's the right metaphor, the metaphor from the natural world for thinking about memory. But it's this really, you know, this is kind of the capaciousness, I think, of Amichai's philosophical imagination as a poet, in that he turns them over and over in his hands. You know, think of the father's wise hands. That's also kind of the activity of the poet, I think, in relation to the language of the poem. And then that artifact, the Amen stone, which is always on his mind. And so there's a little bit of a double entendre there in that first line, chipush shorashim, seeking roots. I think it translates into the English, right? So that there's this notion that the speaker has returned to Warsaw, you know, and he's kind of on a roots trip, right? He's kind of searching for maybe, you know, some stones that belong to his family members, trying to get a sense of his own roots. And he finds that the roots themselves, right, the sort of, this kind of embedded physical, what's more than physical, right? This kind of enduring trace, right? The city has been leveled, the trees have been burned down, and yet, you know, there's this kind of root that remains in the ground that is kind of, you know, trying to find its way to the surface. It's a really elusive set of images. I do not pretend to exactly know what is going on in this last stanza. I know that, you know, the situation of the Jewish past, the presence of the Jewish past in Warsaw is very complicated. And so I think that there's a sense here, you know, that the speaker is referring to that, right? But that one of the things that I take away here is this idea that the search is inconclusive, right? In search of what was and what will never be again. So even if, say, in some vegetative universe, those roots, those Jewish roots could somehow, you know, sprout again. What's the term there? The trees could grow back from them. I don't know. You know, we see all kinds of, we see a resurgence of Jewish culture in many locations in Eastern Europe. So maybe this is sort of what Amichai has on his mind. I don't think so. I think, again, he's just turning over another option, another metaphorical option in his mind to get us to think about the stubbornness of memory and how memory sort of transfigures and transforms itself from era to era. And we finally are left, you know, I mean, the closing, since Shakespeare, or Petrarch really, right? The sonnet is the most famous poetic form where the couplet kind of gives it to us, right? That's kind of sort of the duty of the closing couplet in a poetic sequence. It's to close things up. But we know that the closing and the opening in Amichai are always together. And so the sound here, right? I think in the Hebrew is really marvelous. Shachuach, zachor, shachuach, patuach, sagur, patuach. So forgotten, remembered, forgotten, open, closed, open. And notice here, like if we're reading it in, first of all, it's in the passive tense, right? It's that it's hufal, or we need grammarians here, right? But the whole question of agency that I began with today, right, and about human agency and memory, I think that we're meant to notice something about that at the end again. And then when we think about one of the principles again of biblical Hebrew structurally is this idea of parallelism, right? And so if you wanted to read these two lines and try to create some sort of semantic equity, I don't know. So then in other words, between memory and this kind of these properties of open and close. So if we were to do that, then shachuach goes with patuach, also because they rhyme, right? And zachor goes with sagul. So forgotten goes with open and remembered goes with closed. I don't really even know what to do with that, honestly, because I mean, open sounds better than closed, but you know, when we think, I'll just say one last thing and then I want to open it up for any, you know, final questions or comments. You know, when we think about memory as a product of the present, it doesn't mean that anything goes, right? I want you to know I'm not a relativist in that respect. But I think that we need to just kind of pay attention to the ways in which our current moment are shaping the ways that we, nifal, thank you, Sandy Friedman, whoever you are, nifal. I knew there was a term for it, nifal, hufal, nifal. It's passive, but it's not exactly nifal, is it? You can tell me later. You know, that the way that our current moment, let's just not miss it, right? The commemoration of the pandemic begins now. It already began. You know, the moment that, particularly the moment that you know, the front page of the New York Times kind of reminded us, as if we needed reminding, that we're living in this historic moment. So Tim, I'm going to ask you to open up again, or maybe to call on some people who've been waiting.
Sure. Jason?
I am speaking as a psychologist about memory. And I think one way to look at this work is that it's a reflection of the fact that memory is something that we actively construct and that it's complex. You know, I'm sure all of us have had the experience of remembering, having a very clear memory of something in our childhood, and then, you know, forgetting it and remembering and thinking, no, that couldn't possibly be right. You know, what I know now changes my memory. And I think that's true of individuals and probably collective memory also, is that with experience, with new information, with time, a memory develops. And if it gets locked up, it may become static and stale and not available to reassessment or change.
Thank you. Let's let some more people make comments. Thank you very much.
Raul?
2 points. The first one is going back to verse 8. I think it is extremely strong. The roots are overturning the gravestones. That is, the roots are trying to overturn memory. You know, there is there, or the memory that is precious to us or so. So that speaks about a tremendous type of conflict. The second one is some aspect of memory itself. Borges has a wonderful story which is called Funes, el Memorioso, I don't know really.
Funes, the Memorious.
The Memorious, right. And in there, he speaks about somebody who retains everything. And there is no more space, really. I mean, he remembers the details of the memories, the details of everything which happened on that day.
And that's not so good for his health.
That's correct. And so with these two things, I stop, and I would like to hear your own.
Thank you so much. I find that that image of the stones overthrowing, the roots overthrowing the gravestones, very, very powerful as well. And, you know, it's a sense, you know, that those institutions, like the things that we create to memorialize the past, are not sufficient, right? That there's something that comes to sort of overturn them. That's really beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Tim, I'm waiting for you.
Let's have briefly from Robert.
Yes, sorry I missed part of today's session, but so excuse me if it was already mentioned, but the interplay of forgetting and remembering makes me think of when the Torah tells us to remember what Amalek did to us, and yet to blot out the memory of Amalek, and then don't forget. So just that, how can we remember and still blot out the memory? How do we blot out the memory and still remember? And I guess it's just a complicated relationship.
Well, that goes to that, you know, the sort of psychological benefits of memory and forgetting. I think, absolutely.
So we're at 2:13. So I think if we took another question, we would run over. So I think we'll close here. First of all, I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Mann.
My pleasure. Thank you all for being here.
It's such a rich poem that you shared with us, and I mean, there's like a whole world to talk about, both as a community and individually, in every line that you just took us through. So I think one of the things I'm really going to be thinking about that you shared with us is the idea that the memory starts right away.
I put my my email there in the chat. If anyone wants to follow up with me directly, I'm happy to continue the conversation. And I think we're gonna leave this call open for a few more minutes. Anybody who is able to stay around, wants to say hi, or wants to continue for a few more minutes. That's correct, Julie, right? Yeah, but my email is there.
Absolutely. You made me remember that right after 9/11, when we were all reeling, a friend that had been a colleague, actually said to me, "Do you think that this was like this just happened and then we're going to sort of recover and move on, or do you think the whole world has changed?" And I was so naive, and I said, "No, this was just a tragedy, and we have to process, and then we'll go back to how it was and how wrong I was." So it's the idea that everything has sort of opened and closed at the same time, and that the next phase of life and of the world kind of has already begun, even as we're still in it. Is so powerful. So thank you for bringing us into that, those deep reflections. I want to make sure everyone is aware of our session next week, which will be totally different, and yet also kind of some interesting psychology and theology in there. Our JTS fellow, Dr. Yehuda Eisenstadt, will be going way back in time and looking at the session is called "In the Wake of the Golden Calf, Is God Punishing Us?" It's sort of this medieval theology that in every generation, what we suffer is kind of a remnant of the punishment from of the Israeli community, and there's the sin of the golden calf. So kind of some really interesting textual and theological questions there. So I hope you'll all join us next Monday, same time, same place. And thanks for joining us today. Thanks again, Professor Mann.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Everyone be safe, be well.
Linda, you can go ahead if you like.
Yes, hi, thank you. So I actually, to me, the fruit of the jasmine, the blossom of the vine, the packing and unpacking, and the amen stone are all connected. They're all of the same piece. I look at the fruit of the jasmine as a piece that wasn't remembered. Everybody remembered the other part. They didn't remember the fruit. They remember the wine, but they don't remember the blossom. And then when he gets to verse 7, where he says, "And what do you use to preserve memory?" To me, that's an interesting choice of words, because what would you do with the fruit from the jasmine but preserve it? And I feel like he's harking back to that. The packing and unpacking, to me, is what pieces does he choose to put away, and what pieces does he leave out of the box entirely? The amen stone, to me, it's the end of the prayer, but he doesn't have the whole prayer. What he has in his hand is that last piece. And looking at the amen makes him go back and think about what was lost. The prayer that came before it, the tablet that it was on, and all that was part of it. And to me, what he's saying is, we remember, we as the 3rd or 4th or 20th generation, remember a piece of the memory. We don't have the whole of the memory. It's like whether you're looking at a statue or you're looking at the place where the statue was before it was taken down. Both of those are a piece of what happened. They're not the whole.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Beautiful. Lois? No, you have to unmute yourself. Tim, can you unmute her? There.
Okay, sorry. Hi. This is great. Thank you. I'm struck by verse 6, because as you said at the beginning, the Israeli context is paramount, but so is the remembrance of Germany and Poland and the war. So in verse 6, we're on the blossoms and the fruit, right? And his father. And this discussion of the father is so evocative. It's wonderful. But then suddenly, and especially in the English, the switch is from the father packing packages, and, you know, his father knows how to do things. Yeah. And then there's so much death and everything, so much packing and transport. And suddenly, I mean, I thought of sealed cattle cars.
Yeah, I think that the Hebrew is also very resonant, because that's what I wanted to with the mishloach, which is a transport, which is, I mean, the translation is good. And so the mishloach, I don't know, I mean, maybe. I mean, the word that would give it, the word that for me would sort of, the evidence for that position would be that term mishloach, which is, in, you know, it has a little bit of that passive tense again, right? It's the transport. I think what is in my mind, though, the interference of the other poems about his father. But they're also about his father's death in the other poems. You know, the father's death is also there as well. So, I don't know. We'll come back. Tim, can you just, I'm trying to hear what she's saying, but she's off.
No, I'm back. Hi.
You're back.
Okay. No, it just seems to me it's very abrupt, the association of a well-packaged, you know, you think of brown paper and string and tied and everything is the way it should be. And then why is there so much death in a closed package? So I think it really catches the reader's attention, and you have to think about it. And then to me, that ties up very well then with verse 7.
With verse 7.
Verse 8. Excuse me, I meant 8.
Here's the other thing that would be, I think, in the background for an Israeli reader when they encounter that passage is a very well-known poem by Dan Pagis, which is
Pagis?
Dan Pagis. I'm going to put this in the chat so you'll see what I'm talking about. And some of you might know this poem. It's very short. It's very kind of spare rendering of a speaker and Adam and Eve, and they're in one of these cars, and the term mishloach is also used there. So that might be that there could be some of that there. Tim, more?
Richie?
Yes, hi. Was this poem actually written towards the end of his life, or is it something earlier that just was published later in his life?
I think that my understanding is that the poems in this last volume were written, in those years at the end of his life, and they have that kind of almost like a valedictory, right? They have that sort of summing up feel to them because they make reference. He directly refers back to his earlier work in some of them, and he also revisits, some of the same themes or some of the same situations. So yeah, I'm assuming that they were all written in those final years. But his papers are at Yale, if you're interested.
Is he reflecting, is he only reflecting his thoughts, or is he also reflecting on debates in the Israeli society or disagreeing with what's being...
I think all of that. Amichai, as a poet, was very much of his time. And there's, I don't think that there's really a difference. There's definitely a statement here, but he's, very much of the current moment, both in terms of the topicality as well as the language. There's a lot of, not so much in this poem, but you find a lot of vernacular and slang, all the different sort of layers of Hebrew in the poetry. So he's absolutely of the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John? Go ahead, John.
Who are we waiting for? Tim?
I guess we can't hear John at the moment. Paul Adam? Go ahead, John.
Are you calling on me?
Yep.
Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I'm John Tepper, calling from Tucson. I was taken in the fact that although Amichai passed away in 2000, more modern models that have an analog to his verses 6, 7, and 8 from modern neuroscience. The concept that the process of remembering is in fact that you take your memory, the neurons that were wired however long ago when that memory was, that act or event was created, you literally take it, you unpack it, and you repackage it in the process of remembering something from the past, and then you actually store it away again. And that is the process of memory, remembering, preservation, this unpacking, repackaging, packing, sending, if you will, back to long-term memory. So I was struck by all that with his obvious poetic sense of memory and how it may in fact relate to modern neuroscience.
That's very, thank you for that. My experience in reading poetry and fiction as well, but in particular poetry about these topics is that they often seem to describe, I don't think that Amichai is channeling neuroscience here, but they kind of get to it in a way that is often surprisingly at one with some of these scientific theories. So I would be, if you could put in the chat, John, is there like something that somebody like an amateur could read about this? I would be sort of interested. Yeah. Okay, let's take a couple more. Yeah. Tim, you want to find something? Please.
For the majority of ancient history, and up until I want to say ancient Greece or ancient Rome, history was remembered and passed down orally by like memory. People would memorize, and then that's for like Samuel, Kings, those books. Give us like get credit from oral tradition. Also like what's his name? Father of history. Why am I blanking? Greek father of history. But then like people began writing it down after Rome. How do you compare and how do you contrast, I guess, the history that the ancient traditions of history orally from way past where they would remember, it eventually got written down, versus today where we have like, since, I don't know, since like we write down history, but we also have memories. How do you compare and how do you contrast the different types of narratives or
Oh my God, that's too big a question. You got to come study with me at JTS. Seriously. I mean, you know, I think that one of the things that we see in Amichai's poem is this sense that, you know, there's a continuity of some sort, right? Is that there is, I mean, that's sort of one of the things that is explored in these poems, is the degree to which those older memory forms are either useful, productive, or maybe their utility has simply run out. So, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think that, again, as you know, many contemporary Hebrew poets have this kind of dialectical relationship to the past. Even again, you know, whatever their sort of current moment is, they're somehow relying on some of those older forms. Linda, I'm going to just supersede Tim here. No? Tim, you do it.
Hi. So what's interesting again is I just Googled the fruit of the jasmine, and it says that it's not inedible, but it's not really eaten. So maybe in his mind, this was something that was not worth remembering as well.
I think that in that verse, I think he's kind of saying, why don't we remember the fruit? Right. And we don't remember it because it's not as noticeable as the flower. The flower is dramatic and seductive, and it has this kind of short life. And within Western society, we think that that short dramatic life is something to be honored or privileged, as opposed to the fruit, which is this thing that takes a long time. That's kind of my understanding there of the.
But we also tend to highlight a moment. You know, we're in a very visual age. And unfortunately, since the advent of television and the internet, it's what makes a good picture, what makes a good soundbite that gets aired and noticed. And a lot of the day-to-day, and a lot of the fruit of the jasmine isn't worthy of that.
Ah, well, maybe things will go back. Tim.
That's all we have at the moment.
Okay, I see one last person. I'm sorry, sir. I don't know what your name is, but your initials there are RAS. Let's take that as the last question, yeah? Please.
Go ahead.
Okay. When he talks about his father wrapping parcels, preparing parcels, he ends that with, so they wouldn't come undone along the way, like me. Now, he's not very self-referential throughout this point. This is the one self-reference that comes through, and it's in relationship to his father. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on.
It's really, I think it's a great observation. And it is, I think, thank you. I think it is uncharacteristic that we don't, you know, at least in this poem, right? That we feel in this poem that he really is sort of tackling these broader issues and these kind of, you know, big sort of philosophical frames for thinking about memory. And then the only thing I can think of is it's because it's his father. And, you know, and here I'm going to go to that really, I don't know, you know, the poet here, Amichai, he knows he's at the end of his life and he's thinking about his father. And he does have some really moving earlier poems about both of his parents and particularly about the death of his father. So, you know, maybe there you go. Maybe that's kind of, you're holding up a book cover there. Yeah. Well, he was a young man there. But one of the poems about his father maybe is in that volume as well. So, and I can't even say, what does it mean that he's admitting that he's become undone? I'm not sure what that means either. Is he physically undone? Is he sort of undone emotionally? You know, is there a way in which kind of that neatness, the sort of the way in which you can kind of put painful memories away and not have to deal with them. Maybe that part is now out again and he has to deal with it. I'm not sure. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciated being with you this afternoon. These are really meaningful sessions, and please feel free to reach out to me directly in whatever technological manner you can. And, you know, hope to see you in the hallways of JTS and in the streets of New York City sometime soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Goodbye,
you.
everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.